Thank you all so much for being here and for having us. Special thanks to Angela Gay for organizing and getting everyone together today. My name is Virginia Ferris. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here with my colleague Victor Betts also. I don't know if Victor wants to unmute and say hello real quick.
Hi everyone, my name is Victor. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, and my pronouns are he, him, and his.
So we're here from the Special Collections Research Center as part of the NC State University Libraries. We're gonna talk a little bit about how you can discover lived experience in archival research and some of the challenges and opportunities that brings. So first thing, I'm just gonna kind of introduce what special collections are, what we do at NC State. Our mission with special collections is to collect unique and original materials, things like archival documents, photographs, historical records. So we preserve those things, we make them available for the public to use in research and teaching and all kinds of great scholarship and public use. The content of our materials at NC State in our special collections focus mostly on university history and also on areas of strength for research and teaching at NC State. So agriculture, engineering, textiles, architecture, things like that. We have a lot of great collections about historical aspects of those fields and what people at NC State have done in those fields. So all of these materials are in our archives. They're open to the public for research. They're typically accessed physically. The original materials are physically accessed in D.H. Hill Library, but right now, and all of the time, we also have a lot of digitized material that is open to access on our website, which has a link at the bottom of the page on the slides here. So we just really want to just out front let you all know that while everyone is working from home, we are still fully operational and are here to talk with you about your research and to help you navigate our collections, especially the digitized materials, which are so rich and so many great kind of things you can make use of without going on campus at all. So as we go through our talk for a little bit, I've got my contact information and Victor's at the bottom of the screen. This is a topic that we could talk about for hours. So since we just have a little bit of time, we really want to encourage you to drop questions in the chat box and also make note of our contact info so you can follow up with us if you want to talk more later. So in getting into more of like our topic for today with the symposium, I pulled together just a really kind of random sampling of images and types of material you would find in the archives, and wanted to just put out there for you all to drop a note in the chat box if you have any ideas or thoughts about what kinds of questions these images raise for you. Looking at any one of these or in conversation, any couple of these images, what questions it raises in thinking about gender and equity at NC State. What would you want to learn more based on just a little glimpse of what's here? So as I'm talking in the next couple of minutes, just drop any thoughts in the chat box. We can come back to those. But as researchers, so much of what we can find in these types of records in archives is evidence of the lived experiences of people who worked, researched, taught, contributed in many different ways to the NC State community in our past. And part of that past is we need to acknowledge that our history, our university history, is rooted in the power structures of white supremacy, patriarchy, and many other intersecting forms of oppression that have shaped the experiences of those at NC State. And those power structures determine whose lives have historically been documented in archival records. So when we talk about stories and dominant narratives and counter narratives, it's a really fertile ground when you're thinking about archival records, what we know and what we don't know, whose voices are there and whose are not. So understanding that many voices and stories of our campus community are not well documented in the archives. This leaves us with a lot of silences and gaps in our history that we need to kind of confront with research. It poses a special challenge for research, given that in the past, those who were here contributing in many different ways maybe didn't leave a record, or if they did, those records were not deemed valuable by archivists at the time. So a big part of our work, Victor and me now as archivists, along with all of our great colleagues in the libraries and special collections, is that we really want to address and correct this history, working with our researchers, helping to identify and interrogate some of those silences, and also preventing future silences from developing by actively working with our partners in the campus community to include more voices today that will be part of our history going forward. So Victor and I are going to talk about some of the examples we can find of lives in the archives and ways that we can look at them and understand them, or with the silences likewise, looking at those. So I am going to try to pull up the chat box and see if there's anything we need to address for now, or Victor, if you see anything, let me know. Otherwise, I'll keep it moving. So just briefly, one example of someone that we do know about in our history, Catherine Stinson. You may recognize her name from Stinson Drive, or you may know a bit about her. She was the first female engineering student at NC State. She enrolled in 1937, graduated in 1941, and had a really prolific career in aeronautical engineering. And we are very fortunate to have a whole collection of records from her life and her career, documents, photographs, correspondence, and even an oral history, which is an enormous gift as a resource for research, in her own words, describing her experience and telling us story specifically about being turned away from the NC State College of Engineering by the Dean Riddick at the time, who told her that girls don't study engineering and girls don't go to NC State. She managed to prove him wrong. She kind of called his bluff and was able to enroll and get through in 4 years and then go on to have a really powerful career. So in her case, we have an example of someone who we're really fortunate to have a collection where we can look at it and see actual evidence of her life and do great research and teach students about her as an example, with this great kind of range of sources. But there are many other examples where we don't have that. So I'm going to hand it over to Victor, and we'll shift gears a little bit. So off to you, Victor.
All right, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi everyone, Victor here. So I'll be talking about other examples of silences in the archives and how to interrogate records in relation to our current world today, but also for futures thinking. This person we see here is Justina Williams. She is the first African-American woman academic staff member hired at NC State. Many African-Americans had worked at State prior to Williams' appointment, but they were primarily men, and they primarily worked in custodial or food service positions. We have very few materials on Justina Williams, and this image is the sole photograph we have of her in our university archives. Here's what we know. She was hired as a research technician in 1958, and she worked in the genetics lab working on fruit fly gene mutation. So a researcher today could ask, why aren't there more records of her, right? So when we come across such information gaps and feel like we've hit a roadblock, it's helpful to ask ourselves, what other information can we gather here? Much like any other research processes, asking such questions may take you in a new direction that you hadn't considered before. This was how my initial work into Justina Williams became the impetus for the newly available Asian and Asian American history at NC State, quick plug, because I found out that she was working in Dr. Kenichi Kojima's lab, who was a Japanese faculty member here at NC State. Next slide, please, Virginia. Mm-hmm. Thank you. This next image also comes from our archives and is currently included in the Women's Center's exhibit called Existence as Resistance, The Magic in Blackness, excuse me. Some of you may have heard about it at an earlier symposium session or seen the exhibit in person. There's a section in the exhibit called Imagining Black Futures Through the Archives, which consists of curated photographs from special collections. One of the exhibit's aims is for visitors to think and look at the images through an Afrofuturist lens in order to imagine and create radical Black futures for both the subjects and the viewers. We also created question prompts for visitors as well, which accompany the images. Examples of these discussion questions include, in what ways do you see Black folks existing in the images, and how do you imagine Black futurity? So the image on this slide, which you've been looking at, is a photographic image from 1909, described as chemistry seniors in a lab. What information do we get just by looking at images alone? So at first glance, most people that see this image think it's a cool photograph from the turn of the century. We get to see what 20th century science looked like at the time, or just an overall fascinating piece of university history. Pretty innocuous or banal photograph, right? However, upon closer inspection, you see a Black man standing almost in the margins of the frame and also in the darkest corners, which renders him almost invisible, ghostly, or spectral. When I first came across this haunting image, so many questions swirled in my head, right? Who is this person? Like, what's his name? What's his story? Is he African-American? Is he an African immigrant? Why did the photographer or chemistry students decide to include him in their photograph, or was it purely coincidental or accidental? Because as we know, in the 1909, Jim Crow laws were prevalent, we're deep in segregation and racism, of course. And what's his position? Because we know that the first graduate student admitted into state was 1953, and the first undergraduate was admitted in 1956, so almost 45 to 50 years after this photograph was taken. This is an example of how voices tell a unique story. Images like these provide us a glimpse into the history of people's lives, which are complex, nuanced, and complicated. And it's important to think about the gaze when analyzing all forms of mediums, such as the white male gaze as being practiced in this photograph in most historical documents. What viewpoints, understandings, or belief systems are being communicated in a photograph, manuscript, or government document? Whose voices are we hearing or reading in such records, right? When you begin to critically analyze and decenter existing dominant narratives, you start to get an idea of how and why they were formed. Developing a critical lens as an approach towards research and scholarship helps one to see which voices and lives have been historically devalued, and that the works towards attaining a more equitable and justice-oriented society is intrinsically tied with race, class, gender, sexuality, and other systems of power. We may never get the full story of an individual, but the questions and analyses of those silences and gaps can also be quite revealing in themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Victor. So that's just a real kind of preview of what's available, what's out there in terms of the questions that we can be asking, the lives that we could be uncovering in collections like the archives at NC State. But we really want to encourage you all to visit our website and contact us since we are going to have to sign off. I know we're over time, so thank you for bearing with us. And again, this slide, this yellow arrow pointing to our digitized collections is a really great thing to keep in mind. From our website and that link to digitized collections, you can discover a whole treasure trove of documents, images, film, oral histories from university history and a lot of other disciplines within NC State's kind of strengths for your research, for your teaching, for your own personal interest. And we would love to hear from you if there are any ideas or questions that you have. And with that, I think we will wrap it up. And thank you again so much for joining us today.